Welcome everyone to a webinar entitled How Does Social Media Affect Children? With presenters Sister Marysia Weber and Dr. Kevin Powell. My name is Sebastian Mahfood and I'm the director of ITEST. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our first presenter, Sister Margaret Michael Gillis will author our opening prayer. Sister Margaret Michael is a daughter of St. Paul and postulant director, also known as Formation Director of the Postulants, for the Daughters of St. Paul in the United States. Sister Margaret Michael?
Good morning. Thank you. The prayer that I'd like to open with this morning is called the Prayer for the Good Use of the Media. And it's actually by the founder of my community, Blessed James Alberione, who founded my community, the Daughters of St. Paul, and our brother community, the Society of St. Paul, for the good use of the media and the proclamation of the gospel. So I'll read the prayer and then we'll close with a glory be together. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, amen. We praise you, Jesus Master, for having enlightened the human mind to discover the audio, visual, electronic, and digital media, film, radio, television, the internet, social media, and other new technologies. They are new paths for mission and for the education and uplifting of society. You created everything for us as we are for Christ. May these inventions too sing your glory as Creator and Savior. Lead us not into temptation, Lord, but deliver us from the danger of misusing the gifts you have given us with such wisdom and love. Lead those responsible for these media to work with charity and respect for human dignity. May they always sow the seed of good wheat and keep watch so that the enemy may never sow weeds. Enlighten all listeners, viewers, and media users to seek the fonts of living water. To atone for those who misuse these media, we offer you our daily evangelizing efforts in union with all the holy masses celebrated today throughout the world. We promise always to use media in a way that will help us grow in holiness and for the spread of the gospel. Jesus, Master, through the intercession of Mary, Queen of the Apostles, and of St. Paul the Apostle, grant that through these media, the world may come to know you as the way and truth and life of humanity. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And that version of the prayer can be found in this little book, Live Christ, Give Christ. And the prayer had to be slightly adapted for this day and age because the founder died a few years ago. So we add internet and social media, etc. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sister Margaret Michael. And now I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter. Sister Marysia Weber is a religious sister of mercy of Alma, Michigan. She is a physician, certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. She completed her residency and fellowship at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. She has a master's degree in theology from Notre Dame, South Bend, Indiana. She currently serves as Vice President of Mission and Ministry for St. Francis Health System in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She also serves as chair of the board of directors of My Catholic Doctor, and is part of the Seminary Formation Council, forming seminary formators. Sister Marysia's presentation is entitled Screen Addiction, Why You Can't Put That Phone Down. Sister Marysia, take it away.
Thank you for your kind invitation. Let me just bring up my slide deck here. All right. Well, thank you for your kind invitation. And I have the privilege of speaking to you about a very important topic that is affecting all of us today, both tremendously in helpful ways, as well as some ways that are detrimental. So I will consider some of the statistics and psychosocial effects that are related to the use of electronic media. I want to look at how excessive use of media is altering the brain in ways similar to substance use disorders. And I'll address some of the challenges that we're finding that place our increased reliance on screens, but how to put it now in right balance. That is our relationship with God and with one another. So I'd like to start out by saying, first most, the Catholic Church embraces all that is good in new internet technologies and seeks to really engage us in media as a means of inviting persons into a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. Pope Francis once said, the internet is truly something good, a gift from God, but he also cautioned that the media needed to be a calm reflection of tenderness, that it was to be a network, not of wires, but of people. So despite the many benefits that we have of screen time, there is a downside if too much or too soon exposure becomes a daily routine. So there's a document that came out by the U.S. Attorney General on May of 2023, and he entitled it Social Media and Youth Mental Health. And he did so because after consulting many experts, their research revealed that while social media offers many benefits, there are ample indicators that social media can also harm children's well-being. And so he wanted to really look at this more closely. And so the statistics that his advisors noted that are also printed in this advisory include the following. 95% of teens use social media. 1/3 say they use it constantly. 1 in 3 say they use it beyond midnight. Teens who use social media more than 3 hours per day double the risk of getting depression and anxiety. And this is particular concern given that the average time kids use social media is 3.5 hours per day. 1 in 4 kids spend 5 or more hours per day on social media, and 1 in 7 spend more than 7 hours per day on social media. So he told CNN that our children have become unknowing participants in a decades-long experience. He added that while there's more to learn, we know enough that we need to take action to protect our children. And we also know that screens use has exploded even in very young children. There's a study by the American Academy of Pediatrics that looked at when children at a young age are first exposed to media. And what age do you think that is? I just let you privately just kind of say an age, you know? Well, actually, this study said that they began to interact with media at 2 or 3 months of age, very young. And a high percentage of them by age 1 are using mobile devices on a daily basis, playing games, watching videos, or using apps. So what are some of the effects on human behaviors related to the growing frequency of media in kids and teens? Now, those of us who are medical people know that the brain develops the fastest the first 5 years of life. And so there's a recent pediatric journal, the JAMA Pediatrics, that looked at the brains of 3 to 5-year-olds using a diffuse tensor MRI. It's kind of a high-tech MRI. And they found that kids who use screens more than 1 hour per day without parental involvement, this includes TV today because it's much more high speed than it was decades ago, had lower white matter development. And so this slide shows the pathways of white matter. And you can think of the white matter as like the telephone cables that connect the gray matter of the brain that tells the brain and the rest of the body what to do. And what they found looking at these children 3 to 5 years old using screens more than 1 hour a day without parental or adult participation in that, had more disorganized and more underdeveloped white matter tracks throughout the brain. So if you think this is the relay station that's supposed to effectively send messages, but because of all this visual and auditory stimulation at a young age that they can't cognize and process, it's like putting all this data that's not being integrated, and it sluggishly slows down the movement of those stimuli, that data. And so then the tracks literally, physically, physiologically then are more disorganized and underdeveloped. They're quick to say, though, because they've been chided, to say that no, screens don't cause brain damage. However, it's thought that because of this effect, it kind of creates a too passive engagement of the white matters such that they don't develop like they would have done before screens were exposed to these children at such a young age. Another study, again by the Journal of American Academy of Pediatrics, looked at children who were exposed to screens who were 18 months and younger, and found that those who watched a lot of screens at this young age talked later and talked less. Why do you think that is? Again, so much of what is on these screens is not appropriate for the cognitive capacity of such young children. And so it's a passive reception that they're getting from these cell phones or iPads that they can't cognize. It doesn't ask them to talk. You know, how do children learn? They mimic mama, mama, and then you affirm the child. That is not going at all with the screens. And so they're talking later, and they talk less because it doesn't invite them to imitate. So it's having some of these effects in really young children. We're also seeing limited face-to-face social skills, which are really important in conversation. And, the texting, the spelling. I presented to many teachers, and they say, so many kids, even high school kids, really have difficulty writing a paragraph. So it's affecting their capacity to write essays, which are really very important because it also invites some creativity on the part of these individuals, and they're more likely to want to cut and paste what they find on the internet, which doesn't develop that part of their brain or their own creativity. Another aspect here that we're finding is that, kids sometimes describe feeling bored or isolated when reading a book. Well, I don't know about you. I guess I'm old enough, but I never felt isolated when reading a book. Sometimes the book was boring, but they're just so used to being entertained. They have trouble just paying attention to just black and white written word. Those teachers who are on the playground with kids also find that those who've been exposed to screens at a very young age have poor frustration tolerance. They don't know how to navigate conflict with a real life person on the playground. Why? Well, what did they do if it's on the screens and they don't like what they're seeing? They switch it away or, don't pay attention to it. You can't really do that when you're actually interacting with real human beings. So these are beginning to have effects as these very little children grow up and become adults in the world. Again, poor teachers, they feel like they have to compete with those who are using their cell phones in the classroom. And so many of these kids say, well, I don't remember what was presented. It's not that they didn't remember. It's not a memory problem. It's they never attended. So they never learned it because they never attended to the material that's being presented. So a challenge for teachers as the scores of, reading and writing are going down, where screens have been very, very available. And we saw a big dive in test scores when I heard from teachers and school districts that I've presented to after COVID, where the increased time used for actually entertainment of screens had a profound effect on kids for a couple of years in a row. What about sleep? Well, apparently there's a modern malady in Americans where 2/3 of Americans are said to be chronically sleep deprived. And this goes on because, they're using their cell phone in their bedroom, looking at things. And, God created us just so beautifully. So this is just a picture of the pineal gland here that is right here in this part of the brain. And when it's dark in your room and it's quiet, it tells your brain to release the natural sleep aid called melatonin, so you can go to sleep. Well, if you're on your phone and you hear a buzz or a ding and you want to wake up, your brain says, oh, it's not nighttime, it's awake. So people then are experiencing disrupted sleep architecture, less restorative sleep, and then less benefit from the sleep that they are getting, as well as decreased amount of sleep because they're staying awake longer, on their phones. And so now we're having a group of very young children who are sleep deprived, which was not the case, decades ago. So I just want to look at what's been happening in the past couple of decades, and I'll just cite this just as a statement. There's a lot more to do on this topic, and I present a whole topic on this that I'm not going to go into today. But I have looked at, what some of the positive or most common search engines are, and sex continues to be the #1 topic on the internet that persons search for. Cyberbullying is just increasing. At least 60 to 70% of adolescents today say that they've been victims of cyberbullying. So really to try to address that. And also the more difficult topics of sexting and sex trafficking is really on the rise. This is a bothersome statistic, but we're finding today that internet really has touched a very young demographics. When I first started doing studies on the internet, which I've done for over 25 years, the average first exposure to young children to pornography was 14. Then it was 11. Then it was 9 years old. And I have to tell you, as a professional, I've come across kids who are 4 and 5-year-olds who have been exposed to pornography and had untoward effects from that exposure. But this is a statistic that you'll find children 10 and under account for 10% of all visitors to pornography video sites. That's huge, huge. And the number is climbing. And again, when you do a study, it's a couple of years old by the time it's published. So this number, I'm sure, is higher than this right now. But it gives you a sense that we really need to look at this. Also, 75% of children say their parents never discuss internet pornography with them. So how do you engage in a conversation about something that's not of if it will happen, but when it does happen, to really guide these children that become really victims of a culture that really doesn't try to protect them, but exposes them to any and everything. So what are some of the implications of internet pornography addiction? Well, there's now a group of individuals suffering from an addiction that didn't exist before the internet came into being. And what group of individuals is that? Again, just kind of think about it. Teenage boys and a growing number of teenage girls. Never before the internet became available was there a group of teenage boys worldwide, transculturally, trans-socioeconomic, status that are addicted. And internet pornography addiction is one of the very most addictive addictions that there are today. And the growing number of individuals who have this difficulty is something to really pause and look at. So I want to move on and return to things that really affect most all persons, regardless of generation, if they're excessively using social media. And this is a study done several years ago where a person who checked their phones more frequently said that they were more stressed out. Or those that checked less said they were less stressed out. This is a larger study here that looks specifically at social media. And you'll see that, the younger the generation, the more frequently they're using social media, the more frequently they say, I worry about negative effects of social media on my physical and mental health. That doesn't stop them from using, unfortunately. But the more they use, the more they even self-report this worry and name it as a negative effect. This is a study here on high school students, and this where the more you use your phone, the more you're describing self-reporting feeling anxious. So this was a conundrum decades ago. Why is it the more you use your phone, the more they self-report feeling anxious? And a lot more work has been done to really look at this in a bit more detail. And I'll say a bit more about that later on in my presentation. Here's a study on 8th graders done by the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Study, one of the CDC studies that looked at, some of the behaviors of 8th graders, and it demonstrated those who spend more time on social media, gaming, texting, video chatting on their phones exhibited more depression and anxiety than those who played sports, went outside, attended religious services, and interacted with real human beings. So again, if more activity during the day is virtual, those 8th graders self-report higher symptoms of depression. So, these devices have spawned a novel 21st century neuroses, FOMO, fear of missing out. For all the power to link persons day and night, social media has exacerbated the age-old problem of feeling left out. But the fear of being left out is also having a profound effect on self-esteem, contributing to feelings of inadequacy. Here, this is a study done between 89 to 2015 on 8th, 10th, and 12th graders who were asked a variety of questions. And here you hear these young people just beginning their lives, and there's just a skyrocketing, of around this time frame here, from 2010 to 2015, when they say, I feel like I can't do anything right. My life is not useful. I don't enjoy my life. And it really reached an all-time high during this later time that this study, looked at this. So there are many factors that are coming into play, a person's social experience, their life experiences, their educational, their socioeconomic experience, and also their access to screens. So I want to just ask you, when did the smartphone come out? The iPhone. Well, 2007, you can see it right here. So all of a sudden you're seeing this huge, steep incline of these self-reports when the iPhone came out. And in fact, today, teens, these are the iGens now, are less likely to leave home. Why? Because they're comfortable in their bedrooms. That's where they meet socially. And it's said that with the number of teens who actually gather together face to face to be with friends dropped more than 40% between 2000 and 2015. And again, you can see that since the iPhone was released, how many of them leave their home to socialize with friends. Such that the roller rink, the basketball court, the town pool, and the local necking spot have virtually been replaced by these virtual spaces. And more young adults as well as adults now are describing having biochemical depressions. And I can tell you as a psychiatrist, if you have one episode of a biochemical depression, you're more likely to have another episode. You have 50% increased chance of getting depression. So if these depressions are occurring in much younger ages, they're going to have more bouts of depression. And about a third of individuals who develop a biochemical depression have treatment-resistant depressions that medications don't address yet. We're working on that, but we're not there yet. So depression and anxiety have many, many causes, and I've just said that before, but it's been kind of like a perfect storm with all these things coming together. This is a later study that goes up to 2020, looking at the emergency room admissions for self-harm and completed suicides in 12 to 14-year-old girls. And you see here completed suicides and those have cutting or self-harm behaviors, taking overdose of pills, a skyrocket, after 2012. So again, it's not just one thing, but it's many, many things that has created kind of a perfect storm. And I've presented to a lot of healthcare professionals in ER. I've had more parents who are nurses, who are social workers, who are physicians in the ER telling me, my gosh, I can't tell you how accurate this is. The number of teens that come to the ER every day, suicidal, because of the social difficulties they've had on the internet that they can't process, that's affected their self-esteem, is really climbing and a concern. So let's look at this. Let's take a deeper dive at this and look at what are now called behavioral addictions, because for decades, neuroscientists believed that only drugs and alcohol could stimulate an addiction, but the recent research unequivocally, undeniably states that certain behaviors can and do produce some of the same brain responses that you see in drug addiction. So I want to do a little bit of review of our neuroanatomy of the brain. So here's the brain, and God created us so beautiful. So our brain is just packed with 100 billion cells. And it said that there are about 100 trillion operations that the brain could make, sometimes a couple of seconds when we do something that's really complex. And the cells in the brain. This is like a nerve cell. I'm going to go basic here. So this is like one nerve cell, and here you see what it's called the myelin sheath. It's a fatty tissue that helps direct the neurotransmitters from one brain cell to another, so that you get good communication. So it's part of the white tracts, for example, in this case. And so it's like the myelin sheath are like the plastic coating around an electrical cord. If that gets cut, the electricity kind of pokes up in these different areas, and you don't get good electrical processing. So this is important. There are some diseases where persons suffer with a poorly established myelin sheath, like multiple sclerosis. So you can have somebody have trouble walking because their little neurotransmitters are giving stimuli to move, but it doesn't go to the next nerve of the leg, it goes someplace else. So this is a key aspect that we have in our brain. And this is the prefrontal lobe. It sits on top of my eyes. And we're the only creatures that God created that have such a developed prefrontal lobe. It helps us to learn, to be able to reason, to cognize, to plan, to direct our actions in a way that no other animal can do that God created. And so this is the teen brain at a construction. You can see the myelin sheath again. It surrounds the neural connections, increases the efficiency of the connections. Then there's also what's called pruning of these little connections here. So I don't know if you remember riding your bike, learning to ride your bike. You're riding your bike and you tip over and you go one side or another. Well, after a while, you get to know what the balance is and you get really good. Well, then what the brain does, it prunes all these little stimuli that you fell because you don't need that anymore. So it makes it more efficient and effective now that you've gotten down the tracks that you're using more frequently, which is the next little bullet here. Use it or lose it. The connections that are most frequently used become more efficient, and the connections that are not, really get removed or not as strong. So this is how God created us, with such finesse, which I just so appreciate. So this right here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the reward circuit. This is like the right half of my brain. And this is a prefrontal cortex again, which is really key. It's kind of the seat of the emotional and executive functioning for planning, complex cognitive behaviors, working memory, judgment, inhibitory control, self-regulation. So it's really key. And then the nucleus accumbens, there's a 10% outer shell that releases the natural endorphins or the opioids that are kind of feel good, like where you enjoy a meal or you've had good company of a friend, as well as also the ventral pallidum that also reduces this. But then there's also the core of the nucleus accumbens that reduces dopamine, as does the ventral tegmental area, which is key for having you seek, desire, do something that was pleasurable. So, these two pathways work in concert. And so when you see here the prefrontal cortex, you see how you have to develop a pathway. So you have to think about what you're doing here. If you've had a stimulation to seek something, desire something, want something that was pleasurable, this right here, this little lime green one, very simply, is kind of self-regulation. This is, I've had enough to eat. I'm no longer hungry. I've had enough to drink. So it tells you it's a self-regulation pathway, but you need to develop this in order to have this part of the brain develop a healthy self-regulation process, which really has to do with affective maturity as well as cognitive maturity. Okay, so let's say 45 years ago, a psychologist wanted to look at pigeons. They were already learning a little bit about dopamine, the seek, the desire, the want neurotransmitter. And so they looked at pigeons and how can we increase the release of dopamine in the brain? And he found that the more unpredictably the food pellets were dropped, the more dopamine was released. And so it's almost like the positive reinforcement of getting something that you want to have happen. So now you have Mark Zuckerberg, and he establishes Facebook. And so in 2007, he had thousands of people, who were using his social media, but he wanted people to use it more frequently. He wanted them to engage more. So what do you think he did in order to have people use his Facebook more frequently? His neuroscientists developed the like button. So people then didn't know when they were going to get a post or a like. So it's like positive reinforcements. It's the variable reinforcement. It's the unpredictable positive feedback. So you may not like what somebody posted after you posted something, but you want to check it out. So it causes you to release dopamine. And so, he did that. So now so many of the social media sites have now an interactive component that specifically triggers the brain to release more dopamine so that you want to seek, to desire, to do that which triggered the dopamine. It may not be that you like what you find. Again, you're already seeing kind of disconnect between the liking and the wanting or desiring pathway, which is really the stepping stone towards addiction. Remember your high school psychology class, Pavlov's dogs? Remember, he rang a bell. It was actually a metronome, but everybody says a bell. He rang a bell, put down food. Rang a bell, put down food. The dogs would salivate when the food was nearby. After a while, he didn't ring the bell. He didn't put the food down anymore, rang the bell. What the dogs do, they salivated to a bell. So they were conditioned to have an association to the bell with food. So now we have the buzz and we want to just, seek. What did somebody say to me, or who's contacting me? So we have been conditioned, like these pigeons and Pavlov's dogs, by these devices that have been a key neurophysiologic component to have it be the overuse or the hyperarousal of the brain. So at what age did Steve Jobs give his children an iPhone? How old were they? Never. He never gave his children an iPhone. And what about Evan Williams, who was the co-founder of Twitter? How old were his teenage boys when he gave them, an iPad? He gave them hundreds of books. So what do you think of the fact that the persons who had the money and the means to have neuroscientists developed a tool that they knew was going to alter the neural circuitry of the brain and create a compulsive behavior to use more, not give it to their own children? Online gaming, again, this could be a whole presentation, but teenagers have a highly neuroplastic brain. They're particularly vulnerable to the overstimulation of the neural circuitry that's triggered by the compulsive online gaming that's highly interactive. And I'll say that not everybody gets addicted to internet gaming, and it can be harmless, but the amount of use, like the more you use, the more you're strengthening those pathways in the brain. So that could be a problem. But there's a lot of studies. This is just 3 of about hundreds of them. But you see abnormal gray matter and white matter volume in internet gaming addicts. The connectivity changes in internet gaming disorder. Altered dynamic interactions within frontostriatal circuits reflect disturbed craving and processing. So there's a disconnect between the action of the wanting, the desire to interact, and the capacity to not do it because there's such a compulsion to do it because now the addiction has set in. So there's less of a connection with the prefrontal lobe. That self-regulation is like a tissue paper pathway where the do is getting stronger. So whatever is stronger is the one that predominates. So what we're seeing as the negative effects is there's increased impulsivity, there's impaired decision-making, there's decreased motivation to set goals and complete tasks. All of these are prefrontal tasks that we as human uniquely can do, that no animal can do quite this way. So again, this, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, was put out in 2015. That's the latest. And unfortunately, 2013, excuse me. So unfortunately, they were only calling it something for study. And you see it has all the symptoms that you see in addictive disorders. They won't put in screen addiction yet. And I'm disappointed about that. And you can forget even them having internet pornography addiction, which is even more addictive. So the cultural sway and influence is really difficult here because, it hasn't gotten into the fact where this has become an issue. So on the heels of that, screen addiction can mimic attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. If you get these slow, fast bursts of audio and visual stimulation, stronger than the child can learn to cognize and make a decision about and relate and maybe change pathways or interface with an adult, this is the pathway that's the most. And then if they don't keep stimulating these short pathways, audio and visual, they go through withdrawal. And so it can mimic attention deficit. That then also causes a neurophysiologic experience of anxiety, literally, because they're going through withdrawal. They think they're anxious, it's withdrawal. And that can weigh heavy on the brain and create a biochemical depression, as well as affect their self-esteem if they don't feel like they're measuring up to all the filtered images that they see their friends as if they're really happy. But if they lived with them day in and day out, they'd realize they have their own troubles as well. So shifting a little bit now, people of all ages can make good use of technology, and technology is not intrinsically bad. In fact, it's an extraordinary tool for communication, for business, for social exchange. The issue is how much gaming or how much Googling is too much for the developing mind, as well as, the young mind. And we don't really have an answer to that. We haven't determined specific answers, but we do know that a certain amount of limited electronic media can enrich the mind depending on the purpose and what you're using it for, and some can really affect the mind in a detrimental way. So what can we do about that hyper-aroused mind? What can we do to help address some of the effects that media has had on persons who don't even suspect that their brains have now a decreased capacity for self-regulation and maybe have an addiction and they've been victimized by something they had no idea was going to affect their brain this way? Now, I don't want to generalize. Each person is unique, made in God's image and likeness, and yet the effects of media contributing to some challenges in our desire to intensify our prayer life and our relationship with God and one another certainly is there. So what might be some ways that we quiet our minds? Even science today says that brain needs silence in order to be healthy. And there's a lot of scientific studies that are out for that. But one of them was one where they looked at the effect on the brain stimulation of mice on different kinds of music, like hard rock versus kind of calming music. And then while they were just changing the music, the researcher found that when there was no sound, there's a lot of activity in the brain. And she looked more specifically at that and found that the hippocampus had cell development. And the hippocampus is important for the laying down of more long-term memory. So silence is important to generate new cells that differentiate into neurons that integrate into the system. We need that quiet time to recognize what we're doing, to just integrate some of what comes our way. It also is important to reflect. If you have all this stimulation, auditory and visual, you can't pause, you can't ponder, you cannot pray to process something's happened during the day or call on God to just be present to you. It also helps you reduce stress if you have some silence, because as you've seen neurophysiologically, it continually hyper-arouses the brain, which is why they get anxious, because they're going through withdrawal. It's a hyper-stimulation. And we need it to process information, to kind of get things together. Because even when we're sleeping, our brains are working a mile a minute, processing things. We need time to integrate external information effectively, and our greatest needs to quiet our mind so that we can pray, so that we can develop a relationship with God, and we can build their family and our friends. And even Cardinal Sarah has a beautiful book on the power of silence. And he says, I do not mean simply to not interrupt what someone else is saying, but an interior silence. Without silence, God disappears in the noise, and this noise becomes all the more obsessive. Why? Because God is absent. When you have so much stimulation, you can't get quiet enough to hear that really special voice of our Creator. And so I think this is so key and so true. So what are some suggested practicals for a healthy screen time plan? Well, here are just a few. Say no to notifications. They're automatic. They're going to trigger you to have a buzz or some sound for you to want to check, for you then to stimulate more of your dopamine. They'll make you want to use more and look more at your phone. Remove social media and other apps from your cell phone. Really, how often do you need to be checking? Check means you're getting over aroused and probably moving towards an addiction. only keep apps that are really necessary on your home screen, so that something that you really need. And use an old-fashioned alarm clock. How many people have their phone as their alarm clock, but then they use it for so many other purposes, and then the light, and then their arousal, and the engagement. You're strengthening those pathways of hyper-arousal, which is not what you want to do. Okay, others, no phone in bedrooms. Now, do we really need our phone in the bedrooms? For emergencies, I think people have just fallen into something they've described that they really need that I'm not so sure they really need. Of course, in chapel, also meal times, or of course, not texting and driving. How often is that done? We need to renew the ancient art of face-to-face conversations. How infrequent this is now. So this little says, do you mind if I strap your phone to my forehead so I can pretend you're looking at me when I talk? How often just the phone buzzes or rings and all of a sudden that is more important than the person that's before me? And what does that communicate to adults? What does that communicate to the children that you have at home when you are communicating they're less important to you? Or handwriting, that's so important as well, because, it takes more time to integrate information. They've done a lot of studies, sometimes looking at students in a classroom in college where they're able to use their phone or their laptop to take notes versus just handwriting, and then giving them pop quiz. Guess who got better scores? Those that had to handwrite, because you have to kind of think about what the professor said and trying to integrate a little bit to write it down. Whereas if you're just typing, you also think, well, I'm not going to pay attention. You get a buzz or a ring and you get distracted. So again, it stimulates that frontal part of your brain more if you do handwriting. I'm not saying you should do that all the time, but on your off time to develop it. And also actually reading a book. E-breviary is not the same. Reading a book on electronically is not the same as actually turning the pages of the book and looking at the print. Also, putting your hands in the dirt, actually interacting with real life is also important to build all those pathways that the brain is so beautifully set up to really engage in. Okay, so what's another means of, quieting the mind, to work towards purifying your memory and imagination? Yes, unplug. Consider a media fast, an opportunity to interact with others in new ways. Take time to reflect on your experience of a screen-free day. What did you notice? How did you know screen day compare with using screens? What did you notice when you were interacting face-to-face with others for a day? What were you able to do because you weren't engaged in screens? I think those are things that people can really try to think about doing as a family for one day, for a weekend, as friends. Have a social event with your young kids at home, where that would, they would do that for the day, and get activities for them. They would interact and not on their phones. It helps socialization skills. It will help develop the frontal lobe, which we really need. The American Academy of Pediatrics also set up guidelines for children that they modified since COVID. So FaceTime anytime, and that's remained the same, with a parent guiding the child through the experience. So you never just hand the child the phone, because it can't cognize what's going on. So really what they describe with young children, with a parent guiding, so you would almost guide the child like you would taking the child through a park. You say, oh, look at the duck over there on the lake, or look at this flower and the beautiful puddle here, or, so you're really guiding the child to look with you. You're pausing for the child to also note, maybe say the word or touch, depending on the child. So really the primary focus here, it's not FaceTime, but it's the live person, adult, that's engaged in helping interpret the experience at a pace and a level that the child can understand. So now they also say 18 months to 5 years, 1 hour of screen time of entertainment a day. It used to be 2 hours of entertainment a day. Again, some families would disagree with that. I think you have to really look at what is entertainment. And then now 5 years of age to 17 years of age, no screen time limit, because they want to honor different families' values. Again, I think it's pretty loose here, so I'm not so sure this is a good one, but this is what the guidelines say. And screen time limitations for parents, especially for younger children. So many parents, when they're on a walk with their child, they have their phone. Or I had this dear mother, she was, learning parenting skills. She was a single mom, and she was so proud of herself because she was breastfeeding. But what was she doing when she was breastfeeding? She was on her phone. So, a woman releases oxytocin when she breastfeeds because it helps bond with her child. But what is she bonding to? Because she's not even looking at her child. So, we need to look at care of children would be a time when no screen should be available because there's more interaction with the child when that's the case. And you also want you to plug into your child, because there's more conversation, there's less verbal interaction. So this says, doctor, please tell me, boy or girl, I want to update status on Facebook. So let your child plug into you. That I think that's really key. And engage your child, teach them nursery rhymes, teach them to play an instrument, some interactive games, not on the cell phone or iPhone. That develops their whole brain, which is really what you want them to do. Also, of course, sufficient sleep is really important. Also, healthy eating habits, exercise, because we know that key to affective maturity is self-knowledge. When you're able to develop this frontal lobe, you're gaining sense of self and where you want to move and not move, and that's the beginning of self-improvement. So how do we develop new habits? Basically, when there's a cue, the stronger the link between the cue and the routine, the stronger that's where I'm going to go in a habit. So if the buzz has me have a routine to check my phone, then that's going to be my reward. But let's say I'm nervous about an exam, I have to write an essay, and so my anxiety, I cue to go get a cookie. How often does that help me write my paper? Not too much. So my reward is I'm getting full of cookies, but I haven't done my paper. So you have to, how can I untangle my anxiety to address more a routine that's going to help me get where I want to go? And so changing your habit is important. If you want to do that, you got to change your routine. And that requires some self-awareness. And with regards to Alcoholics Anonymous, they do this really well. So, for example, I like to think of blasted. So if I'm bored, I'm lonely, I'm angry, I'm stressed, I'm tired, these are often the deeper roots of bad habits. They're the cues for bad habits. So let's say I'm alcoholic and my relationship with my spouse is not going well. I'm not doing well at work. And so then my routine then with that anxiety is to grab a bottle. And so my reward is I'm drunk. Well, that's not very good. So instead I go to an AA meeting. That's now my routine I'm trying to develop. I get a sponsor. I see other people who are also working on this. I'm learning new skills. I realize I'm not alone. My reward, I'm still not better with my spouse. I still have problems at work, but I'm probably in a better position to begin to address those bad habits and get free of this really troubling suffering that I have with this addiction because I've changed my routine, because I don't react in the same way to the triggers that got me going. So again, this is really important. So, when we look at changing a habit, we used to think that willpower was like either you had it or you didn't. We realize now it's more like a muscle. Willpower is like a muscle that you have to develop. So what can you do to develop a habit that'll get you more where you want to go? We've also learned that if you are able to have self-regulation developed on your frontal lobe, which is on above your eyes, it's not, well, I have to develop self-regulation for my screen use. I have to develop my self-regulation for my fear of, public speaking. That self-regulation pathway is universal. So if you develop this more in one area of your life, it kind of floods over into all areas of your life. You're able to have more self-regulation in all areas of your life. So as you develop this, you're benefiting your whole lifestyle. But it requires you planning ahead. What is it that you can do so that you know where your triggers are to make decisions, so that this can happen at a better pace. So I'm going to close here with this little video that I hope you can hear. That is kind of a summary of some of what I said. It's actually on my page on En Route Books and Media, because I had the privilege of presenting this topic many times because I couldn't go all the places I was invited. So I've written a book called Screen Addiction, Why You Can't Put Down That Phone. It's also been translated into Spanish by persons who were in the audience who felt it would be good for their audience. So this is on my author's page. And I also wrote a discussion booklet for parents, young adults, and teens that have been used by a lot of schools or parishes, with some facilitators booklet with a few more instructions. So I'll just play this a little bit, 5 minutes.
Would you give a child an addictive substance? Would you let the child play with an addictive drug? Of course not. But research indicates that millions of parents unknowingly are exposing their children to something very powerful, very harmful, and addictive every day. When children play video games, use social media, or watch and interact with electronics, such as phones and smart devices for hours at a time, this screen time can rewire the brain in ways similar to those of drug addicts. And children can become dependent on these devices. Excessive screen time too early in life can be damaging and addicting. This is especially true during childhood because the brain is still developing, a process that isn't complete until a person is around 25 years old. We humans are created for love, for human interaction, not likes. And too much screen time for a developing brain can confuse likes for real human love. Let's examine how screen time impacts our brains. We've learned that intense and repetitive digital imagery modifies nerve connections, which alter how a brain processes information. Marshall McLuhan, a pioneer in the study of the effects of TV on the human brain, discovered that the number of images and the rate of their delivery can alter the person's response more than the actual content. That is, high-speed imagery stimulates the visual and auditory parts of the brain much more than turning the pages of a book. Prolonged exposure can radically change how nerves communicate information to other parts of the brain. One of the neurotransmitters that travels along the nerve cells in the brain is called dopamine. The brain needs dopamine to function properly because dopamine influences the pleasure center of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, located above the eyes, monitors the amount of dopamine, stimulating the brain's pleasure center to make certain no damage is done. Too much dopamine overstimulates the pleasure center and blocks the damage control function of the prefrontal cortex. An overstimulated pleasure center goes into withdrawal and craving, just like an addict. Screen time, such as social media or games, makes you feel good because as others respond to your interaction, your brain releases dopamine. More electronic interaction results in more responses, which leads to more dopamine release. Too much screen time leads to too much dopamine and an overstimulation of the brain's pleasure center. But that's just the beginning. Behavior that happens unpredictably helps to make things even more addictive in some people. Emails, texts, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram posts, and game scores arrive at random. Just like when you win at gambling. You anticipate a response or reaction to your online activity or post, but you don't know when the next response will come. Because of its unpredictability, your brain anticipates the next release of dopamine. You want another message to come because your brain craves more dopamine, so you keep posting or tweeting. The same way gambling addicts continue to gamble. When people say they're addicted to their phones, they're right. People even display symptoms of addiction, including withdrawal and craving, increased anxiety, irritability, restlessness, impaired concentration, and depression. Now factor in something called operant conditioning or cueing. A chirp tells you about a new tweet, or a ding that informs you of a new Facebook post or email. The noise teaches you to anticipate a response before you even know what the message contains. These sounds act as a stimulus and, like a trained pet, conditions you to check the email, post online, or perform some other screen time interaction. This cueing through sounds increases the addictive effect. Withdrawal and craving from screen addiction can be so strong that just sitting in front of a computer or merely opening the internet on your smartphone can trigger a release of dopamine, which makes you seek more social media, even though you receive less pleasure from doing so. What started as pleasant screen time has become an addictive activity to keep you from feeling restless. That's why it's so important for parents to limit screen time with their children and set time boundaries that are strictly enforced. Avoid electronic media at mealtime and in bed. Discuss the basics of brain development with your children and test apps before your child uses them, or play the apps with your child. Digital devices are extraordinary tools for communication and entertainment, but too much screen time for a developing brain can confuse likes for real human love. It's important we teach our children to look into the eyes of another person and see someone worthy of love. Human interaction is essential for healthy human development. So let's guide our children, not to likes, but to real human love. I'm Dr. Marysia Weber for the Catholic Medical Association.
This was actually done by a video animator. I had presented to the National Catholic Medical Association to 750 physicians one year, a variation of this topic. And so he was in the audience and said, I want to do some animated something or other. And Sebastian very kindly also put it on his on my book page and on his Onward Books and Media. So I'd just like to close here with a World Communications Day message from our beloved St. John Paul II, already in 2007, a prophetic, great saint. Media education should be positive. Children exposed to what is aesthetically and morally excellent are helped to develop appreciation, prudence, and the skills of discernment. Beauty, a kind of mirror of the divine, inspires and vivifies young hearts and minds, while ugliness and coarseness have a depressing impact on attitudes and behavior. In the light of truth, authentic freedom is experienced as a definitive response to God's yes to humanity, calling us to choose, not indiscriminately, but deliberately, all that is good, true, and beautiful. Thank you for this opportunity. So that's the close of my presentation, and I look forward to my co-presenter to present then next after an introduction.
Thank you, Sister Marysia, for your presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce our second presenter, Kevin Powell, MD, PhD, FAAP, a retired pediatrician who specialized in the care of hospitalized children. Prior to medical school, he worked as a chemical engineer in industry and academia, earning a PhD in medical engineering from a joint program of Harvard Medical School and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Alongside clinical care, for 18 years, he served on or chaired hospital ethics committees and was a clinical ethics consultant. His last academic position was on the faculty at St. Louis University in Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. He is Lutheran. Dr. Powell's presentation is entitled, How Social Media Affects Children. Dr. Powell, take it away.
Thank you, Sebastian. Wow, that's something to try and follow. Maybe I should have gone first today. Thank you, Sister Marysia. You've covered the clinical side of things so well that I'm going to approach this a little bit differently. I'm going to go with the meta view. And what I want to do is kind of look at the overall viewpoint of things. We have almost 50,000 suicides each year, over 100,000 deaths due to overdoses on drugs, and an incalculable amount of suffering going on. So when I see something that large, that prominent, compared to all the things I work on in pediatrics, I think we as a society need to be addressing some of these problems. Now, when I've tried to look at doing that, I did present one time to a national committee of the ELCA Lutheran Church on religion and science, and I wanted to talk with them about Facebook and my concerns back in 2013 of where that was leading us. I was introduced with the description that I tended to look at things from 30,000 feet. And I had worked with these people for years on other projects. When I came back to present to them, they politely listened to me. They didn't laugh me out of the room, but the idea that Facebook could be stopped or should be stopped just didn't seem to be on the list of things that they wanted to act upon. My goal today is to get people here to go out and act, because it isn't enough to just talk. Talk is cheap. I think that when you have a new technology like this, you need some regulations and some guidelines, and you need those regulations and parental guidelines to be enforced. If you aren't actually enforcing them, they send the wrong message. I think it's pretty clear the problem is large. It's been declared a national emergency. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Association got together and declared a national state of emergency in children's mental health. I don't know what that declaration really accomplished, but it was hoping to focus some more attention on that. I can tell you what I saw as a practicing physician. And I at one time had been an office pediatrician, and I know from my colleagues there that the rates of anxiety and depression are skyrocketing. I'm a hospitalist, and what my colleagues and I had been seeing was people coming in, teenage person who has attempted suicide. We deal with that problem. Now they need to find a bed at a psychiatric hospital. And in too many places around the United States, children can wait for several days in a room in the ER. It's almost like being in solitary confinement. We treat a robber captured in the act better than we treat these children. That is the state of emergency that needs to be dealt with. That is the scope of the problem, or I should say more the severity of the problem. So the thing I want to talk about today is, how do you respond to that? What am I going to recommend that you do? It is anecdotes that prompt people to respond to things. It is the stories. It is triggering that compassion that really gets people to act. It is science that guides you on what you should do. It is science that provides the means for that motivation to become effective. And so I want to convince you that you need both the compassion and the science, the faith and the reason, science and religion combined, to get to truth and get to good actions. Fides et Ratio, it's an encyclical by John Paul II, and it starts with, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. Note that there are two wings. They are both attached to what I view as a dove that's soaring up to reach truth. If you tie one wing to the other, the bird can't fly. So the wings need to be independent in some ways, but they also need to interact. They need to flap at the same time. They need to be attached to the same body in a way that gets the bird to actually move in the direction it wants to. That is the way I view science and religion. They are faith and reason. They are not competitive. They are not in conflict with each other. They are two ways of rising to the truth, and they need to work together to do that, and they can. One key to me is that the science and religion, faith and reason, do need to each have their own domain and purpose, but they also need to interact. They can't be two separate, completely independent domains. I do not want ideology tremendously influencing science and getting us bad science and bad conclusions. Likewise, I don't want science out there wandering off in whatever direction it wants without some moral guidance. If you need convincing on that, watch the movie Oppenheimer from last year. Much better than I will be at convincing you of that. This gives you some image to keep in mind that the two wings need to be in appropriate relationships. This is the chapel at MIT. The inside, there's a sculpture behind the altar and a skylight. A very nice place to be. This is the outside of the chapel. There's a sculpture at the top, sort of a non-denominational interfaith sculpture meaning something. and then this nice red brick circular building. And between the two of them, there is a moat. Between the outside world and the chapel at MIT, there is literally a moat. I'm not making it up. That's why I had to show you this picture. To get into the inside of that chapel and the altar, you've got to go through those yellow doors, walk along that stained glass bridge, and get inside. So I want science and religion to have their separate ways of thinking about things and acting, but I really want them to also be connected so that they are seeking the truth rather than wandering off in their own wildly random directions. So how do we go about this, finding the truth? We start with facts, measured facts. National Survey on Drug Use and Health. 1 in 5 12 to 17-year-olds had a major depressive episode in the past year. So imagine how you get 5 years worth and get through all of that without some sort of major depressive episode. And as Sister Marysia already said, if you have one, you're more predisposed to have a second. Furthermore, nearly half of the 18 to 25-year-olds have either a substance use disorder or a mental illness. These numbers are up quite significantly over the past 20 years. That tells me how important the problem is, how large it is. Now I've got to interpret that data. And here I'm concerned about interpretations being highly tainted by ideology. There have been many examples in the past where a new technology was blamed for debauching our youth. Transistor radios brought rock and roll music to the masses. Cars in the 1960s let teenagers wander off and neck and other such things. The MTV in the 1980s had video music for the first time. Even the printing press back in the 15th century was accused of causing all sorts of harm to society. Technology is not the only scapegoat. Fashion, clothing styles, the miniskirts of the 1960s, the bikini, the flapper dressers, even the hoop skirt of the 19th century, if it showed a little bit of ankle, was considered risque, if not outright obscene. We've blamed technology and advancements and just change as the cause of problems. A scientist looks at that and says, now wait a minute. Certainly both things are happening at the same time. The hands on my clock and the traffic outside are correlated. There are times where there's more traffic outside than others, and I can correlate my clock with that. But does that mean the hands of my clock are causing all of that traffic? No, that's called a specious correlation. Society is ordered and it has rush hours at certain times of the day, and that affects the clock. So anytime we analyze data, we have to look at whether or not the correlation is actually causation, and if so, is which direction is the causation going? So there are lots of studies being published, and as I considered picking some of them out to show to you as I was preparing this talk, I ran across this article in January and said, here is an article in Nature. It's actually a sub-magazine that's only online called Nature Human Behavior, and you can tell it's British based on the spelling of behavior. But it is certainly, the flagship is the Nature magazine, and it is one of the best science magazines for the general public. In that article, in that magazine, there was an article called an umbrella review of the benefits and risks associated with youth interactions with electronic screens. So these people went and looked for all the studies they could find where somebody had studied how does the screen and all this new electronic technology impact human behavior. They ended up finding over 2,400 studies involving more than 2 million people. And then they found that those studies had been brought into 102 meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is some group of scientists getting together, searching all the literature for anything that seems to respond to a particular question that they're interested in, finding all of those studies, comparing them, preferably mathematically using various statistical tools, and deciding whether or not there is really an effect there or not. The idea is to get around all of the bad studies that are out there that are very small studies that somebody hacked the data long enough to get something that was publishable, but you're not really sure that it's true. And the goal of doing a meta-analysis is to deal with that and produce a more reliable science. Meta-analysis is pretty much the basis of all of medical research these days. And there are places like the Cochrane Library where you can go electronically and look up where somebody else has done a meta-analysis. In all of that work, and those 102 meta-analyses, these authors tried to look at what can we determine based on a meta-analysis of the meta-analyses. And they came up with just a few things that were very clear. It is clear we have plenty of data that shows that media is harming children and adults. What they can't do is figure out, well, is that harm more than the benefit of having all this new technology and all of this new communication? That really wasn't clear. And even more would be trying to determine, is there any treatment or anything we can do to reduce that harm or stop that harm? That we don't have a lot of data on. There was, years ago, a whole lot more problem when these first studies were done, determining what's called causality. Which is causing which? Is the fact that a teenager is lonely and depressed causing them to use more screen time? Or is the screen time the cause of the loneliness and depression? Many statistics will tell you correlation, they can't tell you which direction the causality is. The neuroscience that has come along after that, which is what Sister Marysia was showing you, is really the most useful at determining that, yes, screen time itself is rewiring the brain, and that is causing some damage. Trying to decide whether that damage outweighs the benefit requires something far more than statistics. So I looked at that and decided, I'm not going to present a bunch of papers and suggest that these are the clear answers to what's going on. What I want to do is kind of help you decide, how can you learn more about this and follow it and watch as it develops? Next pair. I'm not recommending you read the Nature article. I haven't read through the whole methodology on it. It was just too much. I was happy with the abstract. So one option that you could do is find some pundits who have looked at all the literature and decided they have solutions. The most recent thing out on that is a book published just 2 weeks ago by Jonathan Haidt. He's a professor at NYU. He's written 3 previous New York Times bestsellers. The man apparently knows how to write, how to gather data and put it into a story that he can then tell. I have read excerpts of the paper, of the book. I haven't got through gone back and read through the whole thing after skimming each chapter because it's just out and I wanted to get the actual book, and that is been harder to get at. I could get it on my Kindle, but as Sister Marysia said, you learn a little differently looking at a e-reader compared to reading the book itself. But I have read multiple also reviews. I wanted to know something about this book by other people who knew something about the topic, and is this something they thought was good? And the answer has been yes. And if you look at the subtitle, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness, one of his key points is that the brains of our children are being rewired by their interactions. And that's what Sister Marysia has been explaining to you in terms of the neuroscience. The book clearly shows that teens who spend more time than average on screen activities are more likely to be unhappy. 385 pages. That's a bit of an work to go after. Some of his conclusions are toxic combination of overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world. If that description sounds like what you're seeing is happening to children, this might be the book for you. The Great Rewiring of Childhood, in which the phone-based childhood replaced the play-based childhood, is a major cause of the international epidemic of adolescent mental illness. I'm not as far along on believing that we've proven that causality and all the elements of it, but I think you've heard a very good description of it earlier today. If 385 pages is too much, I'll recommend you read this 23-page publication. Professor Haight said he took much of the information from this cover story and used that to found the book that he wrote. So this is somewhat of the same information, but more condensed. It's more readable when I look at it. Twenge is very good at writing a readable story, and it has a few great graphs. Not quite as many good graphics as Sister Marysia's, but it'll give you some idea of what's going on. Another way of trying to get at this is journalism, finding journalists who look at things and figure out what's going on. I will refer you to this particular article. It's in Pediatric News. It's only 2 pages. It is balanced, where balanced means it at least attempts to create both sides. It's still spending more time covering the problem than the challenges to whether that is true. It's been vetted. The reporter who did it has some skills. The editor who has looked at it had to say, yes, this is right. And these publications always consult at least one outside expert and get a comment from them about, is this right? Is it not? What can we do with it? What it has shown is that the effect is real. Clearly, the screen time is affecting childhood development. The causality is still not 100% certain, or more particularly might be the details of that causality are not as proven yet. And the evidence of a treatment benefit is limited. Now, as a physician, I'm very interested when you're going to tell me there's a disease to know, do you have a treatment, and is that treatment proven to be effective? And very few of these, of the information out there yet has proven that things are effective. Full disclosure here, I happen to review a list of articles each month for this particular, we'll call it a throwaway journal. I am paid to glance at them and tell the editor, hey, these are the 2 I would suggest you put on the front page. This was one of them that I graded 5 stars out of 5, and I told him, yes, I would put this on the front page, except that we've had 2 previous articles on similar topics in the last 6 months. So it definitely belongs in the print version, but, and that's why I strongly recommend it. But for those particular reasons, even though it's probably better than the 2 that we published earlier on the front page, this ended up somewhere else. Go to the online part of it, you won't need to worry about that. The amount of money I get for doing that is too small to change anything that I would suggest, but I thought I should be clear on it. Excellent reporting. So the next thing you could do is go to the some professional organization that you believe in, like the American Academy of Pediatrics. The American Academy of Pediatrics has just created the National Center of Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health. And I really hope that when I first agreed to do this presentation today about 6 months ago, that this particular organization would have would finally have something for me to present to you today. Again, disclosure, I'm a pediatrician, I've been a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics for nearly 30 years. I've paid them about $20,000 worth of dues. In that time, I have been on committees and worked on various projects. But I've also become a little jaded toward the organization because I'm finding that some of the science is getting influenced by a progressive ideology, and that always worries me as a scientist. So far, however, I've got 0 pages to show for you on that. There is a position paper from back in 2013, which I find about as relevant as the Magna Carta that was signed in 1215. It just doesn't describe what's going on today. And that had some limits on screen time, and Sister Marysia had mentioned those, but the amount of science that is behind those recommendations is very small. I think it is better to describe the point, we don't know how much is safe and how much is not. We don't know who's going to get addicted and who's not. On the other hand, it's an important technology, so we're going to have to figure some of that out. And it would be nice if there were some guidelines and some money to do that. So keep an eye out for that. I really think that professional organizations is one place to find some good information. Even better is to find professionals who do this for a living. I may be a pediatrician, I may have a PhD in medical technology, but that doesn't mean that this particular area is my area where I have spent the most time. We planned this today to have Sister Marysia explain that this is her field, and you've had a chance to hear from her. And so if I were to give you a choice between reading Haight's new bestseller with the New York Times versus going back and listening to her presentation, personally, I'd suggest listening to that again. So let me describe once more the scientific method in medicine. We collect data, we analyze it, looking for correlations and paradigms. We try and determine causality based on a p-value. But that p-value really only tells us whether the correlation is strong or not, and strong enough to be better than just random chance. We look for mechanisms that may explain causality. Which direction is causality? We draw conclusions that then pass peer review. We propose treatments. We then measure the treatment efficacy in those studies with some studies. And finally, we implement the treatment and measure the benefit in the real world. You need all of these stages. Much of what I see, and most of those 2,400 studies in the Nature paper, I can tell you are probably only doing the first couple things. They collected some data, probably not enough to be conclusive, found something that met a p-value that would get them published. And publishing is sort of like the dopamine for professors. That's what they need in order to get promoted and become better paid associate professors and full professors. That need to publish influences science more than money. That's my opinion. I don't have a lot of data to prove it, other than I worked in industry, I've worked in academia, and I can tell you when I worked in industry, money was a whole lot less of an influence than anything else. Big concern in industry was, I got to get the right answer because my pension depends on this company being profitable, which means the answer I find has got to be right. It doesn't matter whether I can publish it or not, it's got to actually be right. That's one of the weaknesses of modern science. And you get so many of these publications, and then they come across my desk as, does this thing belong on the front page? And I look at it and go, the science has shown a correlation. Somebody did a study, has the correlation, and now is simply using that as a soapbox to be interviewed and say what they believe should be done, but nothing in the science that they have collected proves whether what they are proposing is true. They have no measurements on the efficacy of their proposal, and I usually say that doesn't belong on the front page. I personally don't think it should have been published the way it was, but that's a problem with journals. Keep an eye out for that type of soapboxing going on when people present data to you. somewhat in conclusion, then the point is, what can you do to keep up with this data and to decide what to do? You've got different sources of information that are coming at you. You have different experts, and one of those experts ought to be the church. It ought to be a place to hear what's the faith part of this problem as opposed to purely the science. One way of accomplishing that is to invite and get scientists into the pews of your congregation and parish. Most scientists I know that go to church leave their science on the front steps as they enter the church and pick it up on the way back out. They don't talk about science inside the church. Nobody invites them to talk about science inside the church. So when we had a pandemic and there were questions about masks, people didn't have scientists that they knew and trusted inside the congregation. My congregation actually had 2 infectious disease experts, that they were physicians. That was their subspecialty. Nobody you could go and trust and say, hey, what do you believe about this? Instead, they're going to the internet and getting the latest garbage off of some Facebook feed. Another suggestion would be support campus ministry. Get the scientists and the politicians who are going to implement this science as policy to have proper moral formation. Again, go watch the movie Oppenheimer if that doesn't make sense to you. That's how I deal with the anxiety and the worry about this particular problem. I try and support campus ministry. I try and teach people how to do the science and religion combined and try and move things forward. I will leave it to experts like Sister Marysia to deal with the particular details of the problem. I'm trying to give you the meta view overall of how can we as a society better determine truth than we're currently doing in a very polarized society, and how do we reach better policies. Thank you for listening. Thanks, Sebastian.
Thank you, Dr. Powell, for your presentation. And now we will entertain questions from our participants. Our Q&A moderator, Sheila Roth, is ITEST Administrative Assistant and Board Member. Sheila, take it away.
Thank you, everyone, for your great presentations. We'll start with a question here from James, and it's addressed to Sister Marysia. He says, is it possible for schools, especially religious schools, to have parents give only flip phones to their child, absent then from social media? It seems we are losing the minds and hearts and souls of our children in the rapid, scrambled, and addictive non-thinking of these social apps. And he also says that Professor Haidt talked about the flip phones in his book that Dr. Powell talked about.
Good question. I think that especially this educational situation has really been exacerbated by the coronavirus, where there's a startling increase in using, iPhones, cell phones for non-academic purposes. When you think of generally what humans do, we do something for a purpose. We know that lunch is purpose to eat lunch. When we're going to meet with a friend, we want to play. But with this social media, you don't know what you're going to get. It's just kind of, you become a passive receptacle of indiscriminate data that you don't know where it's going to go and you don't direct it. And I think that is what has contributed to, creating some concerns about the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual well-being of individuals. So I know that school systems have looked at this. I've had the opportunity to look and work with them. And I think just the purpose for which, the media is used. I think that a flip phone is one thing, but I also think it's the human interaction in the home environment that is very key, because it has become substituted even by the preponderance of how a child might spend their waking hours at home when they're not working on schoolwork or when they're not at dinner or a meal, and sometimes the cell phones are there. So it has eroded the actual human interaction. I think a flip phone would help, but it was like we have just said, it's just one component to many others of what I would recommend to a family of how do you establish, some kind of family setting to develop stronger bonds between the family members, which are interpersonal, belonging, relationship building, healthy brain development means of how God created us to know and be known and to love and be loved. And this phone, no matter how many positive or likes I get, does not have me feel loved or that I really belong and that I matter and I can trust that person to be there when I need them and give me guidance that will help me. And so it's become this virtual actual blur of being too passive as a receptacle, which is a dehumanizing process.
Right, I agree. It's really something. Dr. Powell, do you have a response to that, or should we go on to the next?
Let's go on.
Okay. Peter asks, rural communities in general have more limited access to the internet and social media. Have there been any studies that compare a child's social development in rural areas versus urban areas where one might expect to see proof of the scientific analysis of the issue? If what you say is true, I am thinking that a comparative analysis of this kind might provide greater clarity on this issue for those who find it difficult to assimilate the science.
I think that individuals, what seems to be key, number one, there's not been, rural studies, but when you imagine like some of these third world countries, the internet has become so available and they have their real rural areas like Haiti or Africa. But if these kids are allowed just to be on their cell phones, even though they're on rural areas, the same problems are developing. So it's the human actual interaction that is really key, that is the issue of what is going to allow the human person to develop in a healthy way versus some of these effects that we're seeing neurochemically that then is affecting psychosocially the human interactions that are more disconnected, where you don't feel like you belong as much. So that's been the issue, even with third world countries where they've come in and provided these phones. But unfortunately, it's not quite a tie-in. It's almost the family value of what is it that an individual family is going to establish? What is it that a classroom setting is going to establish that makes use of media for a learning purpose and not for passive reception that we can barely call at times entertainment or recreation?
Having worked in both a large city and very rural areas in my career, about half and half, there is so much other difference between the two cultures, and much more than even the political red-blue states, that running such a study and accounting for all the other variables, I'm not sure I could believe the data anyhow. You'd have to do a study with that type of information that could do regressive analyses and figure out what, after correcting for all these other phenomena like income, education of the parents, etc., and then still find what's the answer, what are the real differences between these two groups. That is so large, it wouldn't surprise me if there isn't something like that out in those 2,400 studies I mentioned, if you have the right search engine to find it, but it's invariably going to be too small to be conclusive and convince you of an answer. I think we're better off at looking at the mechanisms to help confirm what's going right here, rather than trying to approach this with even more research that has multiple variables and then looks at something that's called a Likert scale. People grade their emotions based on sort of a 1 to 5 rating of how depressed are you today, or how anxious are you today? Those are useful for some research, but when they don't convince me as a physician of an answer. I want data like, well, is the suicide rate really different or not? Is the hospitalization rate for depression or anxiety different or not between these groups? Using a variable that's sort of a marker for what's going on, like a survey, is just not as effective and not as convincing. And most of psychiatry, I know, works with Likert scales as their primary use of information. I'm an engineer. I like to see something a little bit more concrete.
All right, thank you. A question here from Elaine. She says, I saw an interview of two men from Facebook who were asked, did you have any idea about the harmful effects of social media? Their answer was yes, but they did it anyway. The information that we add to Facebook can now be used by Zuckerberg's very tight association with the Chinese. President Trump wanted to stop TikTok for that very reason. The bad outweighed the good. Do you agree?
I don't know, Kevin, if you want to answer, you want?
I am aware of, unfortunately, far too many descriptions of what Facebook and Google and other organizations have done, although Facebook gets most of the blame because they seem to be more than willing to do it. They truly understood what worked to get people to spend more time. They had the data. Again, from my work in industry, they were able to run studies of A versus B, do this versus do this, and figure out which causes somebody to click and stay on that screen a little bit longer. It's not hard to collect that data. And if you use that data to try and improve your product, where improve doesn't mean it gets more good information to the children, but it gets them to use that particular product for a longer period of time, you've got to predict that that's going to have some harm. And it's pretty clear. Various people, it's just not the two they are referring to there, have said that yes, that type of thing went on.
And then with TikTok, there's even a closer association with the Chinese. So yes, can they get information about Americans? There are many ways for them to do that. I think the deeper issue, which is what Kevin is pointing to, is what are the detriments of some of these media that we've just been talking about? And TikTok has a lot of sexualized data. It has some few good, but again, it's with so much of this media, though there's good out there, I think the young generation that don't have a developed brain yet and don't have the capacity to really make some of these decisions, and they're just, their impulse control, where they're just curious. It's natural for them to be curious and desire to find out, fall very easily, because it's so available, into certain sites and certain visual exposures that don't necessarily help them in developing affective maturity. And I think that's what we're really looking at. And certainly TikTok, Facebook, all of those are at issue. So, the risk to Americans and how it could be used information-wise certainly is at issue. I don't know all those particulars. I've heard enough about it that it is probably true. If we're looking at the developing brain and how it's just kind of usurping that sense of humanity and interpersonal relationships, that's very true in America. We don't have to go out of country to say that that's happening.
All right, thank you. Question here from Tom on reversibility. What methods are available to reverse bad practices of the younger years?
I'd be glad to say a little bit about that. Okay, so basically, we can say, I get asked this question a lot. And I'm going to put in the context of, when should a child be given, a cell phone? So there are benefits, to communicate with emergency situations, opportunities for social contact with peers, in accessing academic information, and wholesome entertainment. So those are good, but we also know that there are risks that we've talked about, the distractibility, which impairs academic performance, the sleep deprivation, the sedentary lifestyle, the cyberbullying, the addiction, the sexting, all of these things that we talk about. And I think parents have become frightened at all that their children can be exposed to. So they see it as a way to be more connected with their child when they're apart, but there's also a symbol of separation from these phones because it allows the children to be connected with many other people, some of whom they don't even actually know. And they don't have the prefrontal cortex development yet to really be able to, be guided and have an oversight of what's helpful or not helpful. And so I think that what I recommend for families is to do things that we used to do, before the internet became available. How do you kind of build some of this? So if they're already involved in using the phone, then you can still do some of these things. But I would recommend, before you give a child a phone, as a preteen, don't give the child the phone too early. It's so talk to them about the programs. Tell them this is not a toy. Talk to them about how do you speed dial in order that they can get the emergency numbers that they really need, so that you are an ongoing conversation with them about some of the dangers. Tell them they shouldn't be afraid to tell you if they access something that's embarrassing to them, and have kind of an ongoing regular conversation with them. The other side is, if we talk about purifying the memory and imagination, how is it that you do that? If you are exposed to a lot of imageries that lead to bad habits, how is it that then you can use your time and energy to do things that make you feel connected to another person? And I think this is where it would be very important to really look at, having a family meeting at the dinner table where no phones are, where you may maybe share with, have the children go around and the parents say what their rose was or what their thorn was appropriately. So you're talking about turn taking and social interaction, making them pause about what happened in their day. I also use a technique where I have somebody try to purify the memory and imagination where there's, 5 senses, because we can't intensely concentrate at 2 things at once. So if you have these impure images coming up, which often happen if you have become involved in that addiction, or you have these other images and you can't stop, how is it that you then can take like at least 2 seconds to deliberately look at something? 5 things that I see, and see like the crown of Our Lady here on this picture in my office, and then, see the clock ticking. So you're taking 2 minutes to intensely focus. You are now directing, you're regulating your attention. And 5 things that I hear: the echo of my voice, maybe the movement of my feet, someone else in the room, or 5 things that I feel: my feet on the floor, the glasses on my nose, and if there's a smell, if I'm in the kitchen. And I have people practice that in their daily activities, like when they're cooking or when they're brushing their teeth or when they're out for a walk, because you are then actively engaging your senses, which is to push away the distractibility of all these images, which is the withdrawal that you're experiencing, the anxiety that you're experiencing, and trying to develop that prefrontal cortex of self-regulation and placing imagery and sound in a more goal-oriented, focused fashion. Now, this takes a lot of time over years. I've worked with persons who had severe addictions to internet pornography and screen addictions. And when you look at centers that treat screen addiction or gaming addiction across the US and in other countries, what they do: no phones, no TV. They learn how to do laundry, go outdoors and chop wood, play ping pong, do common work projects, do dishes. So much is actual interaction, and let them go through the withdrawal of what their media was, towards helping them move beyond the withdrawal, which is what you would do with somebody who's become addicted, to any chemical. Sometimes, though, because it becomes so addicted, we also know that antidepressants or anxiety medications can help. It's not the panacea, nor it should be primary. And if someone is really that far gone, then they might benefit them. But that's what has been an effective treatment. The key thing is, just like any addiction, when you go back out in the world, there's still alcohol, but more prominently, there's still screens, but persons who are at work, doing work on the computer, which probably is everybody on the screen, if we use it for a purpose of working, we're not becoming addicted. So it has a goal-oriented, time-framed purpose. It's not just passively, supposedly being entertained. I think it's just filled with a lot of things that aren't really even entertaining or pleasant. Sometimes it is. It's more stimulating visually and auditorily. That's where the problem is. So why are you engaging in screens? For how long? And is that the best way to do it? And I think that would be the key for an adult, but especially for the developing brain that we now know really continues to develop until age 25.
I am amazed at how much a young brain, 2, 3, 4-year-old plasticity allows physical injuries, brain damage in some structure or not, for a child to overcome that, to rewire their brain, to be able to regain use of parts of a limb. It is possible to do that. So I want to hold that out as, children can, if you help them, can do some things with it. The wiring by the time you get to be a teenager, I don't have the neuroscience on that. I guess I don't have aware of. But what I am aware of is that trauma events as a child, there's now a field of research called trauma-informed medicine and trauma-informed various other descriptions for it. If you simply ask somebody about childhood experiences before age 5 or 10 of various types of trauma, deaths in the family, breakups, being raped, add all those up, simply count them. And if that number is above 3, 4, 5, that impacts blood pressure problems, cardiac problems at age 40, 50, and 60. That data has been going on for 10 or 15 years, and I just remain amazed at how strong that effect is. So as a general pediatrician, I'm stuck with more of what do I do with the vast majority of people who are mildly addicted. Clearly, if I've got somebody who is severely addicted, I got to get them to a specialist, a psychiatrist. But what do we do with all of the anxiety and depression? How do we treat that? That's more common, that's mild to moderate in all of the 10, 15, 18, 20-year-olds that have this. And that, again, often involves just smaller changes, but it invariably involves cutting down on what's causing the addiction and finding other interactions which are pleasurable and help the person move ahead with things. And that I end up having to help make suggestions to parents. That's the best stuff I can come up with. I am hoping that at some point the American Academy of Pediatrics will have some guidelines on that. Right now, we don't have anything to help.
And I agree. I'm disappointed by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I have a bone to pick on many other issues, like some of the sexual disorders and transgender, and they really leave it wide open for anybody to basically think anything and do anything, and not really facing up to some of the damage that is clearly documented with screens and other things. And so, they've not been very helpful. To say no screen limit between ages 5 and 17 is just almost unacceptable, given the crises that has been just clearly documented by other professionals and other medical entities. But that as it be, I also think if you couldn't, how to explain it simply to parents or to children, and most of us, maybe we've mislearned a song. Have you ever tried to learn a song that you've never learned before and get the notes right the first time? But then if you've mislearned certain notes in a song and you're trying to relearn it, or you're trying to play an instrument like, you know, the guitar, whatever, it's much harder to relearn something where there's been some, you know, missed notes that you've learned than something new. This is the same with the new developing brain. If we have already caused a disorganization in the white tracts, and you know, a less efficient processing that is a sign of an abnormal development of the white tract formation, it's much harder to undo that for a healthy baseline. That's why adults who were born before the internet became available, if they become addicted, they have an easier time, supposedly. Now, again, with addictions, it takes motivation, it takes intent, it takes perseverance to do the things that are really going to help you to do that. And as we know, that's not always the case. You know, if you want to lose weight or whatever it is, we fall out. But if you are consistent, the adult probably will have a shorter period of time to get back to a healthier reward system mechanism, because they were able to lay down a healthier white track at the beginning, because they weren't already exposed to a deformative process that made it, you know, problematic with, you know, these early tracks that we see now in the 3 to 5 year olds, and how much time they are passively given a pacifier. But a pacifier would be not dangerous, as would the cell phone. It's the babysitter in the crib, and then the parent walks away. Or they gave, you know, the child at their store to keep them occupied, you know, a phone. How often have you heard in a store, the parent pulls the phone because they've gotten a phone call, and the child just has this just meltdown? You know, it's just not human behavior. We are creating, you know, this emotional reactivity in an extreme way. And when you talk about trauma, you know, the scripting that these children are getting, again, I didn't talk about, you know, some of the, you know, more the risque behaviors of sexting and internet pornography, but there's a lot more aggressive behaviors between young people now that are much more sexually promiscuous, such that the scripting of what they expect to be normal or expected is young women, college women, have a lot of trauma with what is supposed to be intimacy, because it's all mixed up with just raw sex. And I think the cultural scripting has also been very detrimental to the dignity of the human person. So when you say it's not just one thing, again, I would underscore that there's so many elements that really are involved in that.
But what is, I think, hopeful is, if it's not just one thing, we have the possibility of doing things to help with this. We can teach children other ways early on. Moral formation, can everything you described about how things sort of get worse and worse over time is also true of somebody who never really learned good behavior to begin with. The sociopaths that go back to events at 2 and 3 years of age, and then that just piles on top of that. And again, as a pediatrician, I had to intervene on some of those and then just go, this is beyond me. So at one time, I asked the question of whether, if it was a question of whether this child have ADHD, could the child sit in a 15 minutes in a church and be quiet and listen? And the number of children that have that skill these days has dropped to the point where I just stopped asking the question. I also used to ask the question whether they could tie their shoes. Velcro came along. No child that can engage anymore is being ready for kindergarten based on whether they have the fine motor skill to tie their shoes. And that's good. I think Velcro with shoes gave children independence. I love the new technology. Let them have it. And I, as a pediatrician, will figure out a different question to ask. But children need to be taught how to be quiet and how to not have to have constant interaction with a screen, and how to behave with other children. And the only way they learn how to do that is to actually do so. So we have an ability as a society to try and do positive things. Then again, I'm looking at what can I offer for parents, for people listening, to learn more about this subject and keep up with it. And that was what I was trying to present, and links to all the things that I was presenting will be sent out, I believe, at the with the product of this recorded session. Ways of looking for that information. So I'm not totally sold on the Haidt book. I'm not sure even how to pronounce his name, but it seems to have a lot of the information around the wiring of the brain. It's a way of going after it. Would I prefer that people keep an eye out for the AAP recommendations? Yes. Am I sold on the AAP getting everything right? Absolutely not.
All right. Very good discussion. Go ahead, sister.
I was just going to say, just like Kevin is saying, we need to educate, talk about a covenant with your children, make them part of the, decisions on how a phone is. It's not a toy. So, how do you have parental controls if you want that? How is it that you just develop, an opportunity for them to do chores together, to problem solve together, to do volunteer work together, to take family activities together, to even have a screen-free day and see what that is. Talk about some of the things, talk about sexting, educate them. So many kids have their phone at home. Use a landline. Do they really need to have their cell phone when they're at home? You are there, you're watching them. I think it gives persons to kind of pause and ponder so that you can monitor if your child's wanting to use the phone a lot. Are they having these dopamine surges? That is a sign that they're getting addicted. Can you talk with the child? This is what this means. So I think the education is really key. So we need to be intentional in teaching our children values, to guide them, to examine life and its mysteries of light, that the transcendent beauty of who they are, it's created of God's image and likeness. So again, I think that's what Kevin has underscored so much throughout his presentation as well.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to send it back to Sebastian now for the closing.
Well, that wraps up our Q&A. I'd like to thank everyone for your participation in this webinar. Thank you especially to Sister Marysia Weber and Dr. Kevin Powell for your excellent presentations, to Sheila Roth for moderating the Q&A, and thank you also to Sister Margaret Michael Gillis and Father Vincent Uke for leading us in prayer. In conclusion, Father Vincent Uke, retired priest of the Diocese of Trenton, New Jersey, will offer our closing prayer. Father Vincent?
Let us pray. O God, as our understanding of human nature grows with the assistance of advances in technology, let us pray for the grace to keep in mind the teachings of Jesus Christ so that we can make use of all these discoveries to benefit the kingdom of God in this fallen world. May we find better ways of spreading the good news of the resurrection so that we can enhance the spirituality of society, so that we can direct ourselves to bring us together in peace through good moral behavior. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.